专业名家汇集，市场大势解析，投资痛点事宜，时下热点直击。欢迎收看房东网名家讲坛。
名家讲坛，真知灼见。大家好，这里是58Home 房东网名家讲坛。名家讲坛致力于用专业的态度、专业的角度、专业的声音，解决村友的痛点和疑惑。今天我们特别高兴地请到了 Mr. Garry Shapiro， 他是 Founder and Senior Partner of Shapiro Real Estate and Business Lawyers， 跟我们一起就有关当前，特别是在高息情况下，地产交易中有关的一些法律问题，跟大家一起进行一番畅谈。Hi, Garry.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Totally my pleasure.
Thank you so much. So today we're going to chat about a little bit about the legal related issues, focusing on the real estate transactions. And one of the things that our real estate investors have been aware of that since starting from last year, that has been after 10 times the interest rate increase there, and it's become a very challenging and the situation to some of our investors here. So some reported that they were not able to close the transactions. What are the typical scenarios and why it costs there to those investors?
Well, that's sort of the million-dollar question.
Right.
I think that the challenge of higher interest rates and the fallout or consequences of it is certainly on everyone's mind today. I won't get into some of the background, the financial aspects of why interest rates are higher, the Bank of Canada or political policy, inflation rates, COVID-19 consequences.
Yeah.
But the fact is we are living during a much more higher interest rate environment. As an example, in my own case, my own mortgage, when I went to renew it, it's double the interest rate. I think we got to separate investors from the general homeowner. I think we're dealing with two different classes of people. And I think that there are problems in either case. I think one is more personal, the other is more of an investment issue. We're seeing tremendous pressure on homeowners.
Absolutely.
Within that area, we're seeing a lot of people who purchased homes several years ago. They bought it at a time where interest rates were historically low.
Right.
It was not uncommon to see 5-year interest rates at under 2%.
Right.
And now they have to go to renew, and they are looking at interest rates that are more than double.
Absolutely. We got some investors, they started from 1.5, 1.8 interest rate there, and now it's jumping over 6 or even 7.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we're dealing with the average homeowner, someone who has purchased a home several years ago, and now are going to have problems carrying the home. What we have seen over the last 6 months is a continual increase on power of sale.
Right.
That financial institutions, in many cases, are not prepared to renew with their current borrowers for a variety of reasons. And we're seeing the average homeowner, many of them just can't carry the house. We're seeing that they're trying to sell homes. We're seeing that inventory is increasing. But if you dig a little deeper, it'd be interesting to see who the sellers are. How many of those sellers are in a position where they don't have a choice but have to sell?
That's a great point. From your experience and the current business cases there, what are those? Typically, what are those
sellers? Well, typically, powers of sale will come come about through usually three basic reasons. One is a matrimonial issue, something very personal.
Right.
A loss of a job.
Right.
And the third usually is where someone is not well, illness, for example.
Yeah.
But we're dealing with a fourth case, and that is young couples, young families purchased years ago when interest rates were lower,
Right.
Notwithstanding stress tests, they now find themselves in the position they can't afford to carry the home.
Exactly.
Very simple.
Right.
That is different than investors. Investors may have bought many years ago,
Right.
and they got very good interest rates.
Right.
However, they're coming to renew now, and depending on how many investment, and I'll say condo market, but a lot of them we have clients that have many condo units.
Yeah.
They're having difficulty, one, raising the money, renewing it, being able to carry the costs.
Right.
Now, in some respects, some of them have avoided problems because of the rental market being somewhat better.
Right.
Rental rates have gone up over the past year or so.
Right.
But still, we're not seeing, for many investors, we're not seeing the return that they're getting to be able to cover their carrying costs.
Right.
And many of them are carrying these units at a loss every month.
That's probably the major.
Well, the
investors.
major reason that they're, even though rental rates have gone up,
Right.
they're still not making enough cash flow to cover their common expenses, property taxes. And the other thing is, a lot of them are, like, as I say, are at least at the minimum doubling their monthly mortgage payments.
Right. That's really impacting their cash flow.
Very much.
tremendously. Yeah.
Very, very much. The other thing is, I think that in the investment condo market, I don't think there is one market. I think that on a geographic basis, you have many markets.
Right.
You'll have a market that's north of Highway 7. You'll have a market that's south of the 401. You'll have a market that is in the downtown core.
Right.
I think the downtown core investors have suffered, many of them, because of the change in our working habits. Many people still have not come back to the office. We are dealing with hybrid working models.
More remotely working.
Well, exactly. I mean, and you're seeing the consequences of that in terms of the office market.
Right.
If you're looking at rental rates, I mean, the percentage of sublease market, the number of subleases in the market is probably at a historic high. You're probably seeing more office rental on the market than we have seen in many, many years. I think it's going to take us a long time to get out of the problems that office leasing is experiencing. I think that major employers, like the banks, for example, they want a smaller footprint. I mean, from my own experience, the cost of like rent, office rents, and salaries are my two largest expenses. I would think my experience is similar to what employers' experiences or law firms in the downtown core are experiencing.
Right.
So look at all those investors that were counting on pre-COVID, counting on having all their units filled.
Right.
You're also dealing with a more narrow market because of recent changes, dealing with the inability for foreign nationals to purchase. Or even if they fall in with one of the exceptions, many of these foreign nationals can't afford to buy because they can't afford the foreign tax that they would have to pay.
Right.
So the market in which for investors to sell is narrow. So, and as I say, we're dealing with different markets. A 1 or 2 bedroom unit that an investor may be trying to sell or lease is quite different than someone who had a high-end home who's downsizing for their own use to get into a luxury condo.
Right.
So that's an example of some of the challenges. I think that interest rates will become stable. We might be going into a more stable time right now. I think that I was just reading today that we may see interest rates coming down a bit in July of 2024. Some people say it won't happen until the fall of 2024.
Right.
Well, how many of these investors or homeowners can last that long?
Exactly. So that comes to the point that for those real estate investors that they're suffering, they may start it with pretty super low interest rates there. Now, from the legal perspective, what can they do, or what they're supposed to be? They should be alert, or even they can prepare something proactively.
Well, again, very good question. I think a lot of the comments I'm going to make throughout our time together, you can't look at it as single silos. I think that you have interaction,
Right.
that there's an ebb and flow,
Right.
almost like the waves of the ocean, that it's not just interest rates, it's interest rates, geographic area, location. We're talking about certain market conditions in certain areas.
Right.
So it's not just one factor.
Exactly.
It's very complex, nuanced.
It's more compound with
There's a lot of flow.
elements flowing.
Exactly.
Right.
So I think that if you're looking at investors, I think that they should be thinking renewal. How can they, what type of mortgage they should go to? Should they be renewing with their current lender? Are there other choices in the marketplace? I think that they can be considering other alternative lenders, not private, but institutional lenders like credit unions, for example. Credit unions, a lot of them come under provincial law. They're not federal and therefore are not subject to the same stress tests. So I think that there could be some advantage for investors going down the credit union route.
Right.
I think that investors, you got to be working with the team today. You can't work in isolation. You got to have a good lawyer. You have to have a good accountant. You have to have a good financial person.
Professional real estate
A
investment
team where if you're an investor, I don't care if
Right.
it's one unit,
Right.
one building or one unit or whatever, whether you have 1 or 10 or more, you need professional people to rely on, people that can guide you to go down the right path.
Right.
So we've dealt with a number of credit unions that their stress tests are not as strict, that they're more open.
Right.
You can save money there. I think that you have to look at your renewal. There are advantages to renewing.
Right.
If you go to another lender, you may have to you're going to have to re-qualify.
Exactly.
And the tests to re-qualify today are not the same tests that existed 2, 3, 5 years ago.
Right.
Also on the renewal, the stress tests or what
Right.
what your current lender is going to be looking for can be different.
That could be potentially a challenge there.
Yes, but I think that if you are on the market to sell, I think you got to be more creative today. You got to think of structures, concepts that maybe you wouldn't have thought of before that you need today. There's a concept, for example, of lease to own, We used to use lease to own years ago. And I remember we did a lot of lease to own in 2008. We had a drop in the market at that time. Wasn't a long drop, but we were doing lease to own at that time. Sometimes we have to take concepts and structures, sort of clean off the dust and bring them back into use. So for example, if I'm an investor, I want to sell, maybe I can find a buyer who wants to assume the tenant, a different investor. But the market may be very make Two, you may be able to sell to someone saying, I'm going to give it to you on a lease to own, where you will make payments, a certain monthly payment, certain portion goes towards the purchase price. Now there are pros and cons to get into lease to own, which we won't get into today. However, that is a concept that with the right buyer seller can work very well. You're dealing with perhaps a tenant, but a tenant who will become an owner. So it's not your typical tenant. You can use a vendor take back.
VTB there.
And we're not talking about, as an investor, you're not living there. So it's not like you need that money necessarily to go buy something else. But you can pull some money out, have the vendor take back at maybe a little bit better rates than market. You can get a better price, but take it out on, I would rather get more on purchase price and maybe on the interest rate, take a little bit less. Okay? There are issues there. Are you prepared to give a vendor take back at what the buyer would need for a first mortgage? I mean, you got to be careful. You don't want to take a vendor take back as a second mortgage. And there are a lot of issues with that we won't get into today. And you got to make sure who your buyer is, who's now going to be a borrower, what is the loan to value. So there are a lot of very critical financial issues, risk management issues that you got to be aware of. But there are ways that you can perhaps protect yourself on interest rate. I mean, the big players in the market very often will sign interest rate agreements with banks that you can manage the risk. Unfortunately, smaller investors don't have that same power. But there are ways that you can manage the risk, going to certain types of lenders without going necessarily private, which can be a very expensive road. Or if you're trying to sell, there are techniques in which you can perhaps put you in a better position to widen your market and be able to sell it.
So you use the word creative. That's probably the one that we can learn and we can try to adjust during this currently very, very stressing, very stressful, very
I've been very
challenging environment there.
Absolutely. I feel that there's the saying of what is certain in life, taxes and death. Well, I'll add a third one, and that's change. I think people today have to be prepared to be resilient and be able to deal with constant change. And you got to be open, got to be flexible, but there are ways to handle it. But I think it's important right from, and I said it before, you got to have a good team.
A professional team there to work with you together. Thank you. Those are pretty good comments there. Some investors reported that after they did the closing and they found something that unexpected happened. For example, that they may find the basement is kind of a wet, which they never find it, or maybe went during their inspection, or they skipped the house inspections in order to get the deal. And if those kind of things happened, from a legal perspective, what is the best strategy? How should we deal with that from the buyer's?
I think that we're looking at pre-closing and post-closing.
Right.
And I think you got, certainly in the pre-closing environment, you got to be aware of what your market conditions are.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a seller's market, it's going to be difficult to be able to perhaps do a house inspection.
Right.
Because you may be find yourself in a multiple offer scenario, and you may have to go in without conditions.
A firm offer there. Yeah.
Exactly. And I would say that certainly in today's market, I mean, I think that we're dealing with inventory rates, we're looking at under 40%, that we are formally in a buyer's market. There is no reason why a buyer would be going in on an offer without a house inspection condition.
That's great input.
I mean, there's no reason why. If it was a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, perhaps it would be a different story.
Right.
I'm in a more of a unique position than your average buyer. I usually see the problems that they don't see.
Okay.
And I personally would not put in an offer without an inspection provision, because I've just seen too many problems arising post-closing.
That's a pretty good way to protect whatever the potential disaster.
Well, you need to. I mean, you're talking about, for the average person or even investor,
Right.
As a single expense as probably your highest investment.
Right.
So I think, to me, a house inspection is mandatory. I think that you should get as many access rights as possible. I think that in your access rights, in your provision, in your offer, there should be a separate one for allowing for a mortgage appraisal, that your mortgage appraisal visit is not part of your access visits.
Exactly, yeah. That's a very good input, yeah.
Also, I would reserve at least one visit that would be closer to the closing date. I think that when you're doing your inspection, when you go with the inspector, I think that taking a camera
Right.
and taking pictures of appliances or
Right.
areas of the kitchen, the basement.
Yeah.
One of the difficulties we have is that when we get to the day of or the day after closing, now it's post-closing. Very often buyer goes in, sees broken window, sees a damaged appliance, sees problems.
Right. Sometimes the
it
appliance were
didn't
replaced.
exist.
Right.
They go to the basement and they see water or water stains. And, you know, and the seller says, no, as far as I know, no problems. That's the way it was before. You missed it. And if you didn't have a house inspection, it makes it more difficult to prove, because the period from you sign the offer to the day of closing is the risk of the seller.
Right.
So, you know, we'll say, well, after my inspections, this happened. It didn't exist when I first saw it. So having pictures of before and after, a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very difficult. We have an example. I'm acting for a seller, and the seller, we have a buyer went in, but the buyer didn't move in for 2 weeks after closing. So my client, the seller, genuinely says, listen, I left the house in perfect condition. There was no flooding in the basement. You come in 2 weeks later and there's water on the floor, and they find out it was a broken pipe.
Oh, okay.
How are you going to prove that that pipe broke before the closing?
Right.
You really couldn't.
Exactly, yeah.
So think of it reverse. So I have a buyer's lawyer telling me what is your client going to do about it, and I'm telling them my client is not taking any responsibility for it because when they sold, when the day of closing, there were no problems.
Right.
This could have easily happened within the 2 weeks
Right.
that your client wasn't there. Prove otherwise. If you go to court, the burden of proof is on the party bringing the legal action.
So we typically say some wording there saying that the time is the essence, and also talk about in good faith that when we deal with sometimes those challenges, and your comment there actually could be some very good advice to our investors here to try to learn and even to improve in the future whatever the business transactions there. So that comes to the question that this year, 2023, what are those new laws or regulations that were introduced or became effective that our investors need to be aware of?
Well, you're asking very good questions this morning. Early in January 2023, we had the new laws coming in about foreign nationals not being able to purchase for the next 2 years. I find it interesting. I would have thought that here we are at the time that we're having this chat, being November, that there would have been the initiation of litigation because the act that came in about the 2-year ban is a federal act. While the law, property law, is under provincial jurisdiction. I have yet to see any case, and I'm somewhat taken aback why we haven't, or perhaps I'm just not aware of it. However, it was pretty known in January that foreign nationals could not buy. The exceptions were very narrow.
That's at the
narrow
federal.
In the sense, well, it's a federal law that applies throughout Canada.
Right.
So if you were on a work permit or a student visa, there was a very narrow window that you could buy, but it was based on have you filed income tax returns over a number of previous years. So that would have been a very narrow window. We were also dealing with, there was an exception if the property was $500,000 or lower. That may have applied to certain condo units, but generally speaking in the Greater Toronto area, there was nothing really available for sale at that price point. The government then received formal, I would say, complaints, or became aware of problems in the market. If you were an investor, for example, you wanted to buy into a real estate investment trust, that it prevented you perhaps because you're a foreign national. If you wanted to, it made it difficult for someone who was regarding real estate, although a residential product, like a house, that they wanted to buy, demolish, put up a new house, because they were in the commercial business of redevelopment. So the government felt that that it was a time to make exceptions. So in March of 2023, a number of exceptions came out. I think one of the most well-known exception is being on a work permit. That if you have a minimum of 183 days that you can purchase. There were other exceptions that if you were going to redevelop, there was an exception. If something was mixed with commercial, residential, there was exceptions.
for some mixtures.
Right? There was the exception that at one point, I don't think you could buy shares in a company, but it couldn't be more than 3%. It went up to 10%.
Right.
Except that although, and as I say, the 183 days remaining on a work permit was the most widely used exception, but you still had to pay the NRST, the foreign tax, which today is 25%. So although you may have been able to purchase on the one side, another statute, which is provincial,
Right.
financially made it difficult for you to purchase.
Exactly. So this actually both at the federal level and provincial level.
Yeah, you have two jurisdictions operating within the same area.
Right.
Now you're starting to see immigration policy starting to change. I think that, and I think it's easy for one to point a finger, whether federal government, provincial government, but I do find there are times when different governmental bodies don't always look to see what the consequences of their actions.
Right.
Very often we have what are called unintended consequences.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now we're trying to promote immigration to Canada.
Right.
Where do all these people live?
Right. But they may not necessarily understand
But they can't
what
purchase.
are the possible consequences.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
So here, where we have skilled labor coming to Canada, they're coming on work permits. They want to remain in Canada. They have the financial resources to purchase, but they cannot purchase.
Right.
So then they go into the rental market. That was one of the factors
Right.
why rents started moving up,
Pretty
because
rapidly,
of
right.
demand and supply.
Right.
So I think you're going to start seeing now the federal government is starting to focus in that to try and match immigration needs with housing needs. So hopefully we're going to see some compatibility,
Right.
both with the federal government, provincial and municipal governmental levels working together to deal with these wider, broader issues.
Right. We typically clarify our buyers as Canadian citizens and the
Permanent resident.
permanent residents and non-residents or whatever, students, whatever
Right.
those. Right. So which category actually were impact most for those recently introduced the laws, regulations here?
Well, I think right now is with Canadian citizens and people on PR,
Right.
these laws do not affect them. They're not involved. These are for totally non-resident, like foreign nationals.
Right.
I think that the area most affected are people here in Canada on work permits who can qualify for the exemption, but they can't cover the $25,000,
Right.
25%
Right.
tax.
Right. Because
That's
those
the
kind
most
of
affected area.
Huge burden.
Well, we were seeing prior to January 1, 2023, we were seeing a lot of students coming from China, for example, and they were on student visas with the intention to stay. Many of them have obtained PR. They now we're starting to see many of them become citizens.
Right.
They have
Right.
very good positions, and they were here and they were able to buy homes. I'll try not to give too much of my personal view, but I do think that some of the, I think that a lot of the foreign nationals that could afford and wanted to buy homes
Right.
were at price points
Right.
that were not in the $1 million to $2 million. Perhaps it's the clientele we have,
Right.
but we have many clients that are here on work permits or startup businesses
Right.
that we're looking at price points of $3 million and up. And that would be the market, the price point that I don't think the government was really concerned about. I mean, it's not your average home buyer that's going to be buying a home at $3 million up.
Right.
So I don't know whether, I think it was perhaps a good political tool for the federal government to use. But I'll stay away from my personal comments.
Thank you. And as you mentioned that actually when the government was trying to promote a program, they may not necessarily foresee or expect some unexpected results, whatever consequences that could come out, but actually could come to some negative impact to some other business sectors or governments as well.
Well, I find that to be the case quite often, where they don't think through. As a lawyer, we have to be very strategic.
Right.
I have a client, I have to line up what my concerns are. It's in some respects like a chess game. And I have to see where they are at step 1 and where they're going to be at step 10.
Yeah.
I don't have the luxury of saying, oh, this is okay for step 1, 2, 3. Don't worry about future.
That's not a strategy.
That's not how it works, certainly in the work I do. Often you're dealing with governmental departments, government officials who get switched from various areas of activities. They can be in housing or Canada Mortgage and Housing. They can be in one department one day, another department the next. I find that governments are not always in tune within their own level of unintended consequences. I think that there's not enough communication between different levels of government, that the federal government is not communicating well enough with provincial with municipal. You know, when you come in with a national housing policy, what is the effect? What are the consequences on the municipal level?
Exactly. Yeah, that's why we say communication is the key for whatever the work, the projects there. We talk about we know that you have some experience in litigation, and those are the areas that many of the investors may not be that knowledgeable or not even know what was happening there. Would you be able to give us 1 or 2 cases about the litigation experience cases that you had in the past?
Okay, so you have to separate between buyer litigation, seller litigation. There are times when a buyer is unable to close for a variety of reasons, including most common, not having the mortgage, not having financing capability to close. What can a seller do? A seller's resources or the areas, sort of what they can do is narrow. You're dealing with a buyer that may not have the financial resources to close. You know, I'm not a litigation lawyer. We do have lawyers that specialize in the litigation field that we can refer our clients to, and we're very careful to match up the personalities and the scenario that we're dealing with, get the right lawyer with the right problem. So for a seller, their only recourse may be to work with the deposit paid. That's a reason why that you would want to get the highest deposit on a transaction. We work closely with buyer and seller agents, but I think from a seller's perspective, I think some of the questions you got to ask or your agent should be asking, you know, are people living here? Is there money here? Can they afford it? You're going to have to ask very pinpoint strategic questions. Do you have a mortgage approval? Like I'm asking a potential buyer, do you have an approval? I don't want to necessarily sell to someone where you're not going to be able to close.
Right.
Okay? I want my deposit to be as high as possible.
Exactly.
Ideally, I think the market sort of percentage is 5% in the housing market. I don't want to see a scenario where we had a transaction where a seller sold for $600,000 in the Niagara area and the deposit was $5,000.
Exactly. You want to protect yourself proactively.
I want a deposit that's high enough that if the seller doesn't want to close or is going down that road, that they're going to think twice.
Right.
To lose $5,000 potentially, saying I don't have any other money, is puts a seller in a difficult position.
Right.
But if on a transaction like that, if there was $50,000 deposit, a buyer may not be so quick to just say they're going to walk.
Exactly.
Litigation, in my view, should be the last resort. Litigation, even when you're right, has a cost. Litigation doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And sizing up your market, sizing up the issues, sizing up what you think the buyer's financial capability is. Sometimes the best option is to simply take the deposit money, go resell, and just go forward. What do you do from a buyer's perspective where you have a seller who changes their mind? They think they sold too low, or for whatever reason they don't want to sell. Well, you can deal with putting on a purchaser's lien on title. You can put a caution on title. You can start legal action and put a certificate of pending litigation on title. You could tie up the property such that that seller, if they want to try to resell at a higher price, can't sell.
Exactly. If you put a lien, for example.
There's different types of liens.
Yeah.
But again, you got to be careful. Sometimes the time involved. I've recently had a file where I had a buyer who was 100% legally correct. Seller was trying to maneuver to get out of the transaction with bad faith. And they had a choice: get their deposit back, just look for another house, or take a long time to assert their rights. They had a child that was before the school year. They had a child they wanted to get into a certain school. They didn't want to end up in litigation. They were concerned that maybe prices were going to go up. You always have that risk. Or because of low inventory, you don't have the same selection. Although they were 100% correct for them and what their needs were, they felt the best course of action was to simply sign mutual release, get their deposit back, and buy another house.
You actually brought up those three very important points regarding this topic that we would like to share that with our real estate investors as well. Firstly, litigation might be the last option that you may want to consider. Second, that litigation may have some cost, And third one, litigation doesn't get resolved, happen overnight. And all those three are very good comments that I think our investors probably can just share those.
I mean, I would add that also litigation may not give you the results you were hoping
Exactly. That's another key point.
So I think that as any person operating within the real estate market, especially an investor, running into a legal issue, got to sit down first with your real estate lawyer, get an overview of what your different options are. There may be ways to settle. Sometimes, if you're a seller, for example, and you have a buyer who's having financial trouble, maybe you would want to take a small vendor take back. Maybe you would want to reduce the purchase price. And perhaps if you're reducing the purchase price, you could go to the real estate agents and see if they would work with you to reduce their commission, at least somewhat, that part of the loss or risk would be apportioned between the different players. So we had an example recently where it was property was being bought at $925,000. Buyer couldn't get the mortgage. The property was reduced to $875,000, and
yeah, 50,000
difference. The real estate agents or the brokerages involved reduced their commission from 4% to 2%, where they shared 1% each. They reduced it by 2%. That narrowed, I think it was a $25,000 reduction in commission for the seller, where there would have been a $50,000 reduction. Seller would lose $25,000. Seller was prepared in that case perhaps to go forward. They felt that getting $25,000 less was better than putting the house back on the market, waiting to find another buyer, waiting, there's a time factor. Yes, the seller could have sued. So you sit down with the seller. I said, fine, yes, you're right. But at the end of the day, like, what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve? Now, there are responsibilities on a seller. You just can't sit back. You want to sue, you got to mitigate your damage, put it back on the market. See if you can find another buyer. Don't wait and the market goes down, and then you turn around later and you get less money and you're saying, oh, you see, I'm damaged.
That's a fundamental question.
You have to mitigate your losses. So, but you're dealing with, okay, we're going down litigation. There's going to be a cost. Okay. There's going to be a time factor. It may take a year or 2 years or longer. You're going to go through different markets, buyer-seller markets in that period of time. What are you going to do in the house in the interim? And then you're dealing with, will you get the result you want? You may be dealing with a buyer that just doesn't have the financial resources. You're dealing with a buyer that would become insolvent. So what do you end up at the end with? A piece of paper, a judgment that you're going to get no money on. So you got to balance, what are your goals? What do you want to happen? What is the cost? The pros and costs.
Exactly. You have to consider all the possible scenarios.
Factors. What makes the best business?
Back to what your goal is.
You need to make a business decision.
Exactly.
So we sit down with our client. We go through the different options. We tell them the range, the good, the bad, and then we can refer them to 3 litigation lawyers. They can usually get consultation, and the litigation lawyer will go more from a litigation perspective through the cost, the time, and what your results are going to be.
专业名家汇集，市场大势解析，投资痛点事宜，时下热点直击。欢迎收看房东网名家讲坛。